Hello class, I will be presenting my project on the mass incarceration issue right now in the United States. I am Brandon Townley. Here we go. To first start to talk about this issue, we have to first talk about crime. The United States is clocked in at a 47.3 on the crime rate index in 2019. Crime is obviously bad, and so preventing crime starts with reforming criminals so they don't reoffend. The problem in the United States is that we make up 25% of the world's incarceration rate, despite making up only 4% of the world's population. Obviously, this is a large discrepancy, and something that we could change through a proper course of action. And before we start talking about this issue, I have a video that well summarizes the problem to get a foot in the water of what it's all about.
Good morning, John. It's Friday. A few weeks ago, a company called Visually emailed me and was like, "Hey, Hank, if you could do a high-quality animated video on any issue in the world, what would you choose?" Now, that was a hard choice, but I went with incarceration in America because it is messed up. Now, crime is also messed up. Bad things happen to good people, and that's terrible, and something should be done about it. But we send people to prison to be punished, and to prevent them from doing bad things again, and to deter others from breaking the law. Punishment, corrections, and deterrence. Now, we have this habit of thinking of prisoners as something very external to society. After all, there are literal walls between them and society, walls capped with razor wire and watched over by people with guns. But millions of prisoners are released each year. Today's prisoners are tomorrow's neighbors, so corrections should probably be the most important piece of the incarceration pie. Unfortunately, it is not. We are, however, really good at punishment. America has about 4% of the world's people and about 25% of the world's incarcerated people. We have the highest incarceration rate in the world. Over the last 30 years, that number has skyrocketed, increasing over 400%. 41% of American juveniles and young adults have been arrested by the time they turn 23. Children as young as 13 years old have been sentenced to die in prison. And our prisons violate international standards. Solitary confinement increases instability and violence in inmates and is considered by international law to be torture. But in America, it's not regulated by anyone except the prison officials. No judge, no jury. Arguably the most devastating form of punishment we enact in this country, and yet there is no appeals process. And you think it's hard to get a job in America? Well, we make it intentionally more difficult to get a job once you have a conviction on your record, not to mention just to live your life. Convicts are ineligible for welfare, student loans, public housing, food stamps, and are often socially disconnected from community and family support structures. So in addition to having high recidivism rates, they have very high rates of homelessness and suicide. Somewhere along the way, we started to think that being tough on crime meant being tough on criminals, but that's not the same thing. Punishment is only one piece of a much larger crime reduction pie. And it's an expensive one, with some institutions paying more than $100,000 per year per prisoner. Long prison sentences have helped to decrease crime, but no more than 25% of the decrease we've seen can be attributed to incarceration, and it costs far beyond just dollars. The cost is to people, to our country, to communities, to families, and to ourselves. The policy seems to be, if you've committed a felony, we just give up on you. These wars on crime, wars on drugs, they are wars on people. The smart political move is to appear tough on crime because crime is scary. So we increased minimum sentences, we arrested more people, we sent more of them to prison. That's how we looked tough on crime. But the results are in. It's bad policy. It's cruel, it's short-sighted, and to continue this policy of mass incarceration would be foolish. We're living inside of a massive $75 billion per year failed experiment. 2010 was the first year in nearly 40 years that the number of incarcerated individuals in America did not increase. Policymakers are beginning to realize the magnitude of this failure, but there is a long way to go. John, I'll see you on Tuesday.
Okay. So now going more in depth, why are criminals originally sent to jail? The four main goals of jail is incapacitation, rehabilitation, deterrence, and retribution. Prison staff reported that incapacitation is by far the most relevant goal seen in prisons. This is the first problem with the system because ideally the number one most focused thing on jail would be rehabilitation. so that criminals will no longer become criminals and be tomorrow's neighbors. More in depth, incapacitation in this context is the idea of separating criminals from the general populace will help to cut down crime. As it turns out, incapacitation does not help cut down crime in the short term, but can lead to overcrowding prisons. Incapacitation doesn't properly cut down crime in the long term if convicts are reformed. If they are not reformed. Raising jail time could be a counterexample to this, but that doesn't make sense because just increasing the amount of jail time is lazy and it makes the mass incarceration issue worse. A piece of this area is how prisons wield solitary confinement, and that will be discussed later in the presentation. Rehabilitation was the second key. Rehabilitation is an important part of the jail process, probably the most important process, and should be the most emphasized area in the process. Some prisons are instituting psychological screening to decide whether the convict needs rehabilitation or punishment, or even if they can get rehabilitated. What if they are mentally ill and couldn't understand the issue of their crime? Education and employment opportunities in prison are common forms of rehabilitation. Prison counselors are also often available to help prisoners through the rehabilitation process. A sense of community through volunteer work sometimes rehabilitatizes inmates and proves to be an positive impact on their lives. The third point is deterrence. This is a pretty simple and basic one. That's pretty much the only power it wields is solitary confinement, because deterrence is using a threat to prevent a certain action from happening. Usually they just want them to be obedient in prison and not allow them to riot and do more illegal things. Severity is a big component to the deterrence theory, and severe punishment like solitary confinement is extremely effective. Retribution is the fourth point. Retribution involves saying the punishment should fit the crime. If you start placing punishments on prisoners for relatively small crimes, and they're being punished drastically for it, that could sort of lead to power issues. And retributive justice can be distinguished from revenge in the sense that defendants are expected to give up something in return for the offenses they committed. This originates from the Babylonian Code of Hammurabi, which stated an eye for an eye. Solitary confinement, as stated before, is a punishment for convicts when they misbehave. Solitary confinement can cause mental instability and permanent damage. There are 80,000 prisoners, both men, female, and children, in solitary confinement today in the U.S. Symptoms include hallucinations, hypersensitivity to light and touch, paranoia, higher risk of suicide, and post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Because of these reasons, the international community considers solitary confinement to be torture. Actually, the UN Convention Against Torture defines torture as any state-sanctioned act by which severe pain or suffering, whether physical or mental, is intentionally inflicted on a person. And clearly, solitary confinement is, at the very least, mentally inflicting on the person because of the solitary nature. This is for information, punishment, intimidation, or for any reason based on discrimination. This is a part of the incarceration system that needs to be reformed and changed. So, why is this important? Why is rehabilitation important in the jailing process, and why do prisons seem so unsuccessful at actually deterring crime? And that is because the glaring number of 76% of criminals who are released are rearrested within 5 years of being let out. One potential cause for this could be lack of opportunity, which, as stated in the video before, convicts are ineligible for welfare, student loans, public housing, and food stamps. Convicts are often outed by their social groups and families too, but this is a case-by-case basis. This failure for opportunity after being released causes a high rate of homelessness and suicide with free convicts. We have to identify the rooms for improvement. And throughout this video, I feel like we've highlighted some issues with the system we have in place now. And the most important thing is to take every convict at a case-by-case basis. Every single criminal is different. Some criminals might deserve to be in life for prison for the things they've done, and there's no chance of being rehabilitated, and they are a threat to society, and should not be able to have the privilege of being in society. Whereas some other people maybe did a crime of passion or of something that could be not justified but rehabilitated from. And it's just very key to that not all convicts should be treated the same, and certain convicts can be reformed and released earlier, maybe reworking some sort of parole system. So this concludes my presentation. These are the primary sources I used, along with the video I showed earlier by the Vlog Brothers on YouTube. Thank you for watching. This is Brandon Townley.